Hi everyone, and welcome to tonight's Curious Convos with Dr. Paul Browning and Margaret Barr, all the way from Scotland. So welcome to both of you.
Evening, how are you?
I'm good. Margaret, yourself?
Great. Looking forward to this conversation. Thanks, Andrea.
That's great. We're talking about the importance of trust tonight. So I just want to introduce Paul Browning. He's one of Australia's truly distinguished educational leaders, best known for his work for compelling leadership that is built on trust. He has he's been the CEO of two independent large schools over 2 decades, the current being one of the most innovative schools in the world. He is a sought after speaker at conferences, both for his expertise in leadership and organisational trust, and for his passion for creativity, innovation and entrepreneurialism. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you.
We've got Margaret Barr also from Scotland tonight. She's a lead associate from Scotland for Growth Coaching International. She works with educators as a coach, consultant and facilitator of coaching training programs. Margaret is especially interested in the use of attentive conversations to support the well-being of educators and leaders. Welcome, Margaret. I'm going to let you two have a curious conversation.
Thank you, Andrea. Paul, we should probably let the people listening know that Andrea just introduced us just a few weeks ago, and we haven't really met before, so I'm really looking forward to.
Yeah, and it's lovely to meet you too, Margaret. It's great. This lockdown that we're having across the world has actually brought people together. So an opportunity to meet you has arisen out of that. So I'm really excited to actually learn from you tonight too.
Yeah. So do you want to start? I wasn't familiar with your work, I confess, although I've read your books and really enjoyed them now. But do you want to say a bit about your story and how you came to now?
Well, and Andrea was saying, I've been the principal of 2 schools now. I was the founding principal of a school in Canberra, which is Australia's capital city. And I know people across the world are actually listening tonight, and that too is really quite exciting. I led that school for about 10 years and grew it from 24 kids to 1,500 students across 2 campuses. And then was looking for a new challenge. I was fairly particular about the type of school I actually wanted to go to. And the school, St Paul's School, kind of fitted the criteria I was looking for. So I applied for the headship here, and I was appointed principal, headmaster of the school in the middle of 2008, and moved to Brisbane, Sunshine Coast, Queensland. Beautiful place to live, and started my role there. But I knew a little bit about the school, but I actually didn't know terribly much about its history. And for me, it was a really confronting and difficult time coming from a school that I had the privilege of actually creating and shaping the values and the culture, to a school that was turning 50 and its culture was very much embedded into the life of the school. I was actually quite intrigued about how I could effectively change culture if it needed to be changed, and what leadership practices actually might need to be used to actually shift culture if it needed to be shifted. But I learned when I arrived that some of the horrid stories that actually occurred here. St Paul's School was actually a case study in the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse. It was a fairly big Royal Commission that occurred in Australia starting around about 2013 and finishing at the end of 2017. So it took 5 years. But 2015, we were a school that was selected to be a case study. And there was a public hearing about what actually happened here. And St Paul's was selected because of the depth of the abuse, the extent of the abuse that occurred, and the complexity of the story. So there was a 2-week public hearing. But to give you a bit of a history about it, in the early 80s, there was a music teacher who abused probably around about 20 boys. I suspect there's probably more than that. He was moved on. He was given a glowing reference by the principal at the time. He went on to another school and went on to abuse more kids there before he was finally arrested. But worse than that, in 1989, a school counsellor was appointed at the school by the name of Kevin Lynch. And he had come from another very prominent Brisbane school as a school counsellor there, and he moved across to St Paul's. And it was discovered in 1997 that he had been abusing students as they went to see him as a school counsellor. And it's come out that he abused at least 120 boys during his time at the school. I suspect there's probably at least another 50, 60 boys who were abused by him who haven't yet come forward. And I suspect that because I actually have his diaries here at school and I know all the names of the students he saw. But he also abused the same number of students at the previous school as well, where he worked for 10 years prior to that, and possibly an equal number of street kids. So he's quite possibly, or was quite possibly, one of the worst pedophiles in Australia. When he was found out, he took his life, and that was in 1997, and he committed suicide in January. So the whole thing was squashed, really, as we probably know from stories of abuse. And it only really came to light in 2001, and there was a public hearing then. The school went through the courts, through the hearing systems. People thought it was over. It ended. But when I arrived, every month or so, a new abuse victim would actually come forward. But then when the Royal Commission was announced, 2 years of my life was spent gathering evidence for the public hearing. And we actually gave over to the courts over 100,000 pieces of evidence in a 2-year period. So my job was essentially gathering that evidence and handing it over for that period of time. I then decided to actually go to the public hearing. I thought it was really important because as you realise what was actually occurring at the school and why the culture was as it was, it was really important to actually go on a journey to bring healing to the community and healing to the victims of abuse and healing to the staff who felt blame or shame or somehow responsible for it as well. So I did. It was an incredible journey for me personally, but continues to be an incredible journey. But it was a real insight into the whole notion of trust. And hence that came my study into trust. When I left my previous school, I left a culture where I enjoyed people's trust. They valued me as a person. We worked collaboratively as a team of professionals. We had really robust, good, honest, open, transparent conversations. And I came to this organisation and people kind of said, well, who are you? And why the dickens should we trust you? And there was no collaboration. There was no open conversations. There was no vulnerability. And it was having a significant impact on student learning and the way people worked and turned up for work. And as I unpacked the story, I understood why, and then really was on a journey of, well, how can I actually effectively change that? So that kind of gives you a brief insight into my story, Margaret. You come from a different perspective though. So I come from a perspective of organisational trust and leadership trust, but you come from a perspective of relational trust, and that really intrigues me as well. So yeah, what do you do, Margaret?
I started off as a business studies and economics teacher, and I ended up as a head teacher of a school, a city school in Glasgow. The head teacher is like your principal in Australia. So that was where I kind of ended my career. I did other things as well, along the way. And I retired in 2012, and I decided I'd always wanted to continue working, but not as a head teacher. It was time. I didn't have the energy that I had, when I was younger, and, the school needed somebody new, and I needed a new interest. And I'd always been interested in coaching, always. And people in school did say that I had a kind of coachy style of leadership, but I don't know whether I did or not. I certainly didn't pursue any studies about it. But I took the opportunity with a wee lump sum in my hand and a retirement pension to go back to university and do a master's degree in coaching psychology.
Yeah.
And it was just the best thing. It was absolutely such a privilege, such a luxury to just be studying something I was just so interested in. I was kind of greedy for information and experiences. I loved it. And I did that at the University of East London. So that's where my lump sum went, university fees and plane fares up and down and hotels and so on. And that's where I met Christian van Nieuwburg, who's the executive director now of Growth Coaching. He was the program leader.
Oh, wow.
And, I absolutely loved it. And the more I studied it, the more I thought, oh my goodness, I wish I had known this when I had been in schools. I wish I had practiced this. I would have been a much better head teacher. I mean, I was good enough. The inspector said I was, they were very happy with what we did, but I know that I would have been a better head teacher, and I would have been a better head of department and better teacher. I'd probably been a much better parent and everything. There's just so much about coaching that I just think it's got so much potential. So when I stopped, when I finished the master's degree, well, during the course I met John Campbell. Christian introduced John Campbell, who's the founding director of Growth Coaching, to a group of us. There was a kind of network meeting, and John did a workshop. And I thought, this is wonderful. I really like John in the way I really like Christian, just this huge integrity, this interest in people, this huge credibility. I seemed they were, alike in some ways. And when I discovered about the work that John was doing, I thought, this is wonderful. Here's this organisation at the other end of the world with doing all this coaching and education, founded on research, based on research informed, but so practical. And I love to hear that as well. And John and Christian were setting up growth coaching in the UK, and said, would I like to be involved? So I was thrilled to be involved, especially because of the nature of them as people, and GCI as an organisation. So since then, I've been doing workshops in Scotland here, which I love, because I love having still that connection with schools and with teachers. In particular, I do quite a lot of work in Glasgow with former colleagues and so on. Love doing that, and do various other things as well. So back to trust. Tell us about your studies, and how about the study that you did, and how you've discovered people build trust in these practices that I've read about.
As I said, the impetus for me was just the contrast between the two organisations. It's really interesting. You don't notice trust until it's actually missing. And there was a great quote, I can't remember who actually said that. It's like foul air. You don't notice air until it's actually foul. And then you really pay attention to it. And certainly coming here, it was fairly obvious within the first few days that I walked in that there was an absence of trust. And that was, you could see that in just the way people actually behaved and the way they interacted with each other. But you could also see it in the physical environment, the things that have been set up and the processes and procedures and protocols that have been put in place that basically said no one is to be trusted until proven trustworthy. And trust really is the thing that makes things work. And you would see that too, Margaret, in a coaching relationship, that unless there's trust between two people, or trust between a leader and the people they seek to lead, then it really isn't going to work. And Thomas Giovanni said a really good thing. He said, there's no point developing a strategy as a leader or casting a vision for an organisation unless you first have trust, because no one will actually come on the journey with you. It's really quite a profound thing. And so the more I looked at it, the more I realised that the most important thing for a leader is actually to build trust between themselves and the people who they seek to bring on the journey. And if they don't have that trust, then really there's no point to it. You would be just managing a situation. You wouldn't actually be building or something exciting and transforming an organisation into something quite unique and bespoke. So realising that and seeing the absence of trust, I decided to do a PhD into it. I wanted to know what leadership practices, what practical things could I do as a leader that would develop that culture of trust. St Paul's School is a big school. It's easy to build trust in a smaller situation, a one-on-one relationship. Much harder when you've got a staff over 200 people, as St Paul's did at the time. And so I went and did a PhD with the university, and I did a multi-case study where I went looking for 4 highly trusted transformational school leaders. And I chose independent education because in independent schools in Australia, the principal or the headmaster is typically the CEO of a not-for-profit business. So the skills I was looking for would be transferable to other areas, like the corporate world or the not-for-profit world. Then I went into their schools and I actually asked their staff, the question, first of all, tell me what trust is. What do you see it as being? And second of all, what is it your head teacher, your principal does that engenders your trust in him or her? And so I did all these interviews and then gathered the data, did a cross-case analysis and found that there were 10 practices or 10 things that were common between all 4 leaders. And the interesting thing when I looked at it was, I looked at the data, is we often think that trust is built over time. You build it, you grow it. And that's not true according to my data. One of the 4 principals who I studied had been in their school for 1 year. Another had been there for 17 years. There was no correlation between tenure and trust. It was actually came down to what they were doing. We often think too, it's perhaps linked to our personality of who we are. And again, my data showed that wasn't the case either. 2 of the principals I studied were extroverts, 2 were introverts, 2 were female, 2 were male. One person said to me, trust isn't about being nice, because I'm certainly not nice. And if you met this lady, she is a very intimidating lady, but gosh, she had the trust of her staff. They so admired her and she did amazing things in that school. It actually all came down to what they were doing as leaders. And that was what I was trying to find in my study. A little bit different to a relational situation. I was looking for things that leaders can learn and get better at. And so I found 10 practices that were common between all 4. So yeah, found it basically, and then have applied that to my own leadership to improve St Paul's School and make it a better place.
Yeah. It's interesting what you say about trust not being necessarily being over time. And I mentioned to you the last time we spoke briefly, I've always been interested in the fact that if I'm doing a workshop, with GCI, and we're doing an introduction to leadership coaching workshop, for example, and part of the program is that about a couple of hours into the course, you do a demonstration. And you do a demonstration of coaching just to show the model that we use and to show the skills. And so, these are people that I've never met before generally, it's people that I don't know. And you're trying to make the point that there are certain things that you can do to coach that can be really impactful straight away. And I've never yet not found somebody who volunteered. And so this is somebody who, 2 hours before had never met me, and yet they volunteer to be coached by me in front of everybody else. And I've often thought, I'm grateful for it. I've never analysed it much, but I wonder whether it is something about all the kind of background, your provenance in a way. They haven't met you before, but they maybe have heard about you, or they know a wee bit about you, the way you are with how you're engaging with other people. The fact that I say quite clearly, I might mess up here. Obviously I'll try not to, I'll try and do this well so that we can all learn. But if I do something wrong, I'll be really interested to hear what people are saying about it, because it's all about learning. And so trust, it's a precious thing. And, what do we do to deserve to be trusted? How do we behave? What makes us trustworthy? Can people get a sense of the fact that
I'm willing to bet, Margaret, that there's commonalities between the practices that I've found for leaders and what you do. I'm willing to bet that some of those practices you actually display in that workshop, and that engenders that person to trust you. You've already described some of them. So one of the practices that I found that good leaders do is they admit their mistakes. They show their vulnerability. But more importantly, they not only share their vulnerabilities, they actually fix their mistakes. And you were just describing that then, Margaret, that you're confident enough to actually say to the group that you're leading that, I might mess up. And that sort of thing really engenders trust, because people want to know that we're all human. We are all human, and want to know that we are confident enough in ourselves to actually say, yes, I have messed up, and admit that. It comes down to that humility. So, there's lots of things. I think there'd be commonalities between how you coach people and how people seek to lead that would build trust.
Yeah, yeah. You know, another thing that we would do in a coaching conversation like that. I mean, obviously there's coaching conversations where you say, right, let's arrange to sit down and have a conversation, and we'll use coaching. And then there's the sort of coaching approach that you might use in, all your professional conversations, that real, good listening and focusing on solutions and so on. In a kind of sit down, let's arrange it formal kind of conversation, I think that I don't like the word contracting. It's the proper word for what you would do at the beginning of a formal coaching conversation like that. I'm not particularly keen on the word, but the notion of what you do, I find, is really, really powerful and really important. I think it's important to have a shared understanding of what's going to happen and a bit of give and take. This is how I'm proposing the conversation would go. Is that okay with you? Or talking about the level of confidentiality that there would be or not. Because, for example, if you were coaching me and you're my line manager, you couldn't guarantee me absolute total confidentiality about every single thing that I would say, because there are some things we would need to agree in advance that, because of your role, you couldn't guarantee. So kind of clarifying that, seeking permission to give thinking time, to say, that coaching is it's a particularly focused kind of conversation. You're happy that we use this growth model, and by that time in the workshop I've already explained what all of that is and people have a goal. But also to check in with people while we're working. I'm not going to give you advice. I'll ask you questions, and if you feel the need to have a think about it and not answer right away, that's fine. I'll not ask you again. So don't feel this kind of social urge to, speak before you're ready. Is that okay? So all that kind of checking in, and are you okay to start, that type of thing. I think we need to demonstrate an equality. It's just key. It's key, and we have to believe it. It's not just about manipulating and doing things, to appear a certain way. We have to believe in that.
No, I would probably correlate what you're talking about there with another one of the practices I found for leaders, or another couple. Another one was genuine care. Highly trusted leaders genuinely care for their people, and what you're talking about there is actually meeting somebody where they're at and having that empathy with them, and going on a journey with them, caring for who they are. And another practice, I found that engenders trust as a leader is listening, really, and you're describing that there too, really seeking to understand a person and what they're feeling and what they're valuing, and making sure they feel comfortable to go on the journey. Another practice you mentioned about was confidentiality. Keeping confidence is a really key thing to do to actually engender trust. Margaret, I'm just looking, there's a great question here from James from Malta, which I'm excited the fact that there's actually somebody in Malta listening. But James, so James, evening, how are you? Is building trust something that school leaders can learn, or is it something that you either have or you don't? James, great question. What I actually set out to find were practices that you could learn and get better at. What my research actually showed, what the data showed, is that everybody is actually trusted to a degree. In actual fact, our natural disposition is to trust people. That's our default position. There's a great book called looking for the title, Talking with Strangers by Malcolm Gladwell. And he really talks about that whole notion about our natural default position of trusting people. But we're all trusted to a degree. But my data actually showed that it's not a question of whether you're trusted or not, but actually how much are you trusted? So when I did the initial part of my research, I surveyed leaders throughout Australia and New Zealand who participated in the selection process. 28 leaders participated in that. There was criteria about how they got into the project. They needed to be leaders at big schools, but they returned data that showed that everyone was trusted, but some people weren't trusted as much as others. And what I was looking for was those really highly trusted people. And then as a result of that, what were they doing? What can I learn as a leader to get better at? So I would argue that as leaders, we're all trusted or trustworthy, but you can learn things like you can get better at listening. You can be better at keeping confidences. You can get better at caring. You might have to work at some of these practices, but you can actually get better at them. And that's what I was trying to find. I was, advice that I could give to leaders where they could get better. There's another question there from Janet about, did my study differentiate between the views of teachers and middle leaders? Yes, it did. When I went into the schools, I asked anybody to come and tell me a story about why they trust their principal or their leader. And so I had the cleaners all the way through the teachers to the deputy principal. I also spoke to the chair of the governing bodies as well. So they all shared stories about why they trusted their leader, because ultimately, as you know, as a head teacher, Margaret, you're leading a community. Everyone matters. Everyone is important. So that was, that's true. And then I would also say there that, as I've run workshops, I've often said, I've run workshops with teachers about leadership, because we're all leaders at some point in the day or some point in our lives. My favourite definition of leadership is by Ken Blanchard, where he says, as soon as you're seeking to influence another person, you're actually in a position of leadership. So you don't have to have a position to be a leader. As soon as you seek to influence someone to go to the movies with you, or you're coaching a sport team, or you're teaching in a classroom, you're leading a group of children. So these practices you can apply in a classroom setting or any sort of leadership situation. So really interesting findings.
Yeah. It's really reassuring, actually, that there are practices that you can learn and practice, that you can,
Yes.
you can get better at. That's a really reassuring thing.
Yeah.
I think, as a leader, to know that we're all, well, we know we're always learning anyway, but there's something specific there.
And it was helpful. It was helpful for me because, as I said, I came into a school where there was very low levels of trust, and I needed to turn the culture around. And I wanted to know, how could I actually do that? St Paul's is on a huge campus. I was telling you earlier, Margaret, it's 125 acres, 1,600 kids at the time when I arrived, a big place. And I was walking up to 8 kilometres a day to pop into classrooms. Well, the first response I got was, what the dickens are you doing in my classroom? Why are you here? Because there was an absence of trust. But the second thing is, gosh, that's a huge portion of my day. Is it actually having an effect? Is it working? And so I wanted to know that. How could I get better? So as a result of the study, the 10 practices I then put into a rubric. Teachers know what rubrics are, but an assessment tool, which could give me feedback about my leadership. And I used that amongst the staff to ask them to give me feedback about, how good a listener am I? How good am I at coaching? And coaching was another one of those practices, Margaret. And it's interesting when you get the perspective of the people you lead, what you like. And I found I needed to work harder at some of those practices and get better at them. And coaching, Margaret, was one of them. I thought it was a reasonable. I've never done a course and never studied it. I've read about it. But my staff actually said, "Oh, you're actually quite rubbish at it." And that was a bit helpful. So I ended up going to the Centre for Creative Leadership, and I did a course in Singapore a couple of years ago where I learnt how to become a better coach. It's fascinating stuff.
Yeah, I'm interested in what the focus on listening, and I'll maybe share a wee technique I was given. Sometimes you're listening to somebody and you really are listening really deeply and you're fascinated and so on. And as teachers, we always want to input something, we always want to contribute. And we have this kind of, I'm saying we because I still pay my General Teaching Council's dues. I always call myself a teacher. I'm not giving that up. But, we have this instinct to contribute by helping and by thinking, oh, I can give you some information here. I can help you. Don't you worry about it. I can sort it. And the advice is, when you have this urge to say something, or to contribute or to interrupt, as it were, just briefly ask, in a nanosecond, ask yourself this question: how confident am I that if I do stop the flow, or even if they're thinking quietly, with this comment I want to make, how confident am I that it'll be better to do that than to just keep quiet? And if you're confident, do it. But if you're not confident, just contain your discomfort for a wee bit longer, because hey, it's not about you really, it's definitely something that does take practice to really listen and not interrupt.
And listening was one of those 10 practices that highly trusted leaders actually demonstrate. And my experience through the Royal Commission and after that has shown me what a powerful thing listening actually is for building trust. And as you said, Margaret, the temptation to jump in and say something, we've all got it. We all want to contribute to the conversation, but that's not what listening is. After the Royal Commission hearings, the floodgates were open here at St Paul's. So I went to the hearings. I begged the commissioner at the time to allow me to stand on the last day. And I hadn't told anybody why I was there and who I was. And so on the last day, I was supposed to give testimony, but we ran out of time. But I stood and I made an apology to the people who were in the room. And I apologised on behalf of the school. I wasn't there at the time. It wasn't my fault, but somebody needs to apologise and acknowledge people's pain. And really, that's the first step of listening, is acknowledging people and recognising who they are. I'm going to grab a quote out of a book here called The Good Life, but I'll try and grab that while I'm talking. But after that, the floodgates literally opened, and for 3 months, 7 days of the week, 3 to 4 victims or their family members were reaching out to me and approaching me, either by email, by phone, coming to see me, to share their story with me. And I learned very quickly, what can I say to a victim of abuse that, as you said, that will actually help? I learned very quickly, I had nothing to say that would actually help. You know, I'm not a victim of abuse. I have no concept of what the torture is like for them. So I learned very quickly that my job is just to listen and to really seek to understand who they are and their world. And I learned too that, you know, I was a terrible judge of character. You know, I learned some terrible things about who I am, and I had to face that reality. For example, if you see a homeless person on the street, or somebody coming towards you covered in tattoos, or somebody who's on drugs, or an alcoholic, you know, I look at that person I used to look at that person very disparagingly and just judge them, thinking, well, they haven't made very much of their life, have they? But now I really understand why that person is who they are. And there's this wonderful quote that I found in a great book called The Good Life by Hugh Mackay. And for me, this was my most powerful learning. It says to listen actively and attentively to another person is to put our existing beliefs and dispositions at risk. What if this person is right? What if I have to change my mind? What if I have no answer for this? If you are really understanding another person, if you are willing to enter his private world and see the way life appears to him without any attempt to evaluate judgments, you run the risk of being changed yourself. You might see it their way. You might find yourself influenced in your attitudes. The risk of being changed is one of the most frightening prospects most of us face. And you know, that's for me is one of the most seminal quotes that I came across, because in listening to these people and learning how to really listen and never interject, never interrupt, but really seek to understand, it's changed my view of people and who they are. Where I first, mind going at 1,000,000 miles an hour, thought I knew that person, so many times I'm wrong. And the power of listening when it comes to trust, you cannot underestimate it. So for me, the healing that has occurred for victims of abuse as a result of just listening is quite remarkable. So I really resonate with your comments there, Margaret.
Powerful stuff. I can see there are some other
questions.
We haven't got them. I think I'll get them. Do you want to pick some here?
Look, you could pick quite a few. Probably one of the things I could say, if people are watching live online, that's my newest book called Principled, 10 leadership practices for building trust. And it goes through each of the practices and it tells the story of the Royal Commission as well. So it's Margaret, I'm really privileged to think that you actually read it. So thank you so much.
Yes, I was saying just before we started the broadcasting, I really enjoyed it, and I'm grateful to Andrea for introducing us so that I discovered it. And I find that you've got a very accessible, authoritative, incredible, and yet accessible style of language and reading. It's a book that's really you want to read more of it. You know, I found it really, really interesting. So
thank you. Yeah, and it was written for leaders in any situation. So leaders in schools, middle managers, principals, leaders in the corporate world, leaders in the not-for-profit world. And if somebody's there asking about a new leader, what advice would you give them? Juggling all the demands of the new role, and the role is significant when you're a principal. Margaret, you know that. But I've been a principal now for 22 years, and over those years I've come to realise that the most important thing you need to do is to build trust. It's actually about the people. It's not about you. It's about the people. And if you don't build that trust, if you don't spend time attending to that, then everything else is a waste of time. So, yeah. And when you build that trust, the things that can occur are quite remarkable. You find your workload actually is significantly less, because everyone is putting that extra effort in because they believe in what you're wanting to do. So that was a question from Claudia. So thank you, Claudia.
Right, and I saw one from Rachel. What happens in education systems if professionals lose their trust in policymakers? What do you reckon? Yeah. I'd love to say to Rachel, what do you think, Rachel? Because we were just saying that this is quite artificial. If we were actually all in a room and somebody asked that question, I would say, what do you think? But what do you think?
And Rachel, she probably has written that question because she has lost faith in people. And it's interesting, we were emailing earlier today, Margaret, just so, my book starts off talking about how trust is actually in decline across the world in all sorts of organisations and institutions. It's probably at its lowest ever in terms of when you look at trust in governments, trust in policymakers, trust in the media. And we can see that pretty clearly how it's playing out this COVID-19 situation too, and seeing that in Australia in terms of, do we trust our government to make these decisions or do we not? And at a time where we really need to trust the governments, we're struggling to do that because they've proven in the past to be untrustworthy. It's really difficult. But certainly part of this book that I shared here talks about when trust is broken by a leader, and usually unless that leader is incredibly brave and is willing to be incredibly humble and acknowledge their mistakes and genuinely seek to fix those mistakes, it can only be changed with the removal of that leader. And I'd say when trust is lost, it's very hard to come. It's not impossible, certainly not impossible, but very hard to come back. And it does take great humility. So policymakers, I think we all as educators struggle with policymakers, don't we, Margaret? Most of these policymakers, I'm sure, have never been in a classroom or in a school, and well, what would they know? We're the ones on the ground.
Oh gosh.
We have a question there from Chris Brown. How applicable to the broader community of parents and ex-students have you found the 10 practices to be? Harder to shift the story in the community? Does it take years? Thanks, Chris.
Margaret, do you want to have a go at that, or do you want me to have a go at that?
No. What have you found in your you've been?
Look, I must admit, the whole community is looking to you as a principal of a school to be the leader of the community. When you take on a school or any organisation, you're actually not just taking on the students and staff, but also the parents, and in my case, the past students, the broader community. It's quite a big community that you lead too. So I can't imagine how many thousands of people are in my community, but they all are looking at you. When you're the leader, you're under the spotlight. You receive greater scrutiny, and you, in a sense, can't ever really be yourself because you never know who you're going to meet in the shopping centre, or when you're down buying some milk, or you're relaxing on the weekend, you're in your thongs and your short. So one thing I'd say to people is be yourself, be who you are. Don't be somebody else. People want to know that you're authentic. The practices come down to being a leader, and so your job as a leader is to build trust, to build that culture of the school where everyone can flourish. There's a great book here by Brick and Schneider, Trust in Schools. That would be the seminal piece of work on trust in schools and education. Brick and Schneider are two academics in the States, and they were, just very quickly, they were engaged by the Chicago district to evaluate a reform act. So talking about policymakers, the question we had earlier, the policymakers had come up with a new idea to improve schools. They engaged Brick and Schneider to actually go into schools to see whether that reform act was having an effect or not. But quite coincidentally, they found nothing to do with the Reform Act. They actually found that schools with high levels of trust between teachers and students, trust between parents and teachers, trust between parents and the principal, teachers and the principal, schools with high levels of trust had a 1 in 3 chance of seeing students learning progress more than the 12 months you would hope to see in a given year. So 1 in 3 chance of improving. And schools with low levels of trust, only a 1 in 7 chance. So they concluded that trust in the community amongst parents, students, teachers, everyone was having a significant impact on student learning. So Chris, sort of answering your question there, the second part of your question really, yeah, culture is hard to shift. You know, I have learned, sadly, you know, I was pretty enthusiastic as a leader and wanted to change things in a moment. You know, I wanted to come in and, yep, here am I can change this place, and she'll be right, I'll have it fixed up in a couple of months, if not 12 months. But I found St Paul's was a very hurting community. It was deeply hurt. And it's taken, I would say, 10 years to actually shift that culture to a point now where, you know, we were acknowledged as one of the world's leading innovative schools or learning organisations, and we were acknowledged as the Australian School of the Year last year. So it's taken a lot of work, but a long time and a lot of patience and just consistency in those practices.
Paul, Susan Elliott-Johns from Canada has asked, what you're also saying is it's important for leaders to be able to build trust between the teachers and their staff too.
Yes. So what I'm saying is it's about people trusting you as the leader. And it comes down to what you do that will build that trust. It doesn't come down to who you are. When I did my study, I wasn't so interested in, you know, things like he's honest or he's a person of integrity or I like him. It was actually about what did I do consistently that would build that trust. And the most important group of people I can build trust with as a leader of a school are the teachers. But then I would also say that I'm actually a leader of a community. So teachers are really important, but so are the cleaners, so are the front office staff, so are the people who maintain the school, who mow the lawns. We are a team contributing to the education of young people. And if we're not working together as a team, all playing our part, then we're not going to do amazing things for our young people. And the only way we're going to work together as a team is unless we have that culture of trust.
Yeah.
Paul, everyone's very interested in your rubric. We have quite a few people asking about the rubric. Can you tell them where the rubric is available?
Look, I have a website, and I don't know whether you're going to email some of the books.
We will email the resources out, so yeah. But
my website is www.compellingleadership.com.au. And on that website, there's a free ebook that people can download. That was my first book, which has the 10 practices, and it has the rubric in there. But then there's also, if you're interested, you can automate that rubric, and people across the world have actually done that. So the rubric's a really great tool for self-reflection. If you, as a leader, want to have a look at it, you can use it to reflect on your own leadership practice. But what's more powerful is when you actually ask the people you lead what they think of you. As I said, when I applied it to my staff, I thought I was great coaching, but I was pretty rubbish at it. So I had to go and do a course and get better at it. But that website will enable you to administer that rubric with your team that you seek to lead, and it will generate a report for you. And with all the data that I've been collecting, it will benchmark that data against leaders across the world, middle managers, principals, primarily in education. So you can see, you know, where you fit, how much are you trusted compared to others, and which practices do you need to work on. The ebook is free, but the rubric, there's a small charge to that. I don't actually make any money off that, but all that money goes to support the education of young people and on the island of Santo in Vanuatu. So St Paul's School supports 3 schools, communities there. And if you look at some of the pictures on the website there, these are really, really poor people, and they have no qualified teachers. The sum total of their resources is a pair of scissors and a few bits of cardboard. Their classroom is literally a thatched hut, which was destroyed in a recent cyclone. So St Paul's supports those schools, and if you use this rubric, that money goes to actually supporting the education of those young people, and it's enabled us to build new classrooms, trade training centres, put in adult literacy programs there. So it's having a really great impact. So it's a win-win situation. You get feedback about your leadership, you help the education of these people. So, and the proceeds from this book, I should say, actually go to a scholarship fund for children of abuse victims, so they can attend St Paul's School as well. So, because a lot of those victims of abuse from the St Paul's School are now returning and sending their kids to the school, which for me is just so humbling and so exciting.
We have another question from Charlotte Rendell-Short. How would you expect trust to be different when principals are faced with leading in a crisis, as in the current situation?
I feel like I've done all the talking, Margaret. Do you? Okay.
No, well, we'll go. I was going to pick up on what you were saying about humility there, because there is a question here, but let's do that one from Charlotte. How would you expect trust to be different?
Yeah. Charlotte, I've found that in a crisis situation, this is what we find ourselves now in, is a critical incident. I would describe that as a critical incident. Schools in Australia are closed at the moment. I don't know where you are at the moment, Charlotte, but schools in Australia are closed. There was a heck of a lot of work to actually move it online. We're now reopening next week, and there's actually an equal amount of work to actually reopen, which is quite strange. You'd think you just reopen and they come back. And I found in a critical incident, I've led through quite a number of critical incidents. The Royal Commission was a very protracted and elongated critical incident. Other critical incidents might be the death of a student or a staff member, but your leadership actually does shift in those circumstances, and things that shift your decision-making particularly. So highly trusted leaders make consultative or collaborative decisions, very rarely make decisive decisions. But in a critical incident, you do have to make decisive decisions. So my leadership has had to shift, and I'm having to make decisions very quickly without consulting staff. But fortunately, I have the trust of the staff to enable me to do that. But if I do get it wrong in those situations, I've learned that I need to admit my mistake and say, sorry guys, I got that one wrong, but I'll fix it. So you can still build trust, but your leadership does change in a critical incident. Margaret, you probably experienced critical incidents as well when you were a head teacher.
Yes,
yeah.
Yes, and it is quite humbling when everybody's looking at you and they're expecting you to make the decision right away, because it is a big thing. And yes, I agree. It's you need to have people's trust in the first place to be able to carry off these decisions. And yeah,
I found in this situation, one of the hardest things to deal with was actually staff anxiety. So just before we closed, the anxiety of staff was rising exponentially for all sorts of reasons. And again, listening was something that I found was the only thing I could do. I couldn't actually say to them, you'll be right, it's okay, you won't get sick, you'll be fine. That doesn't help. You need to acknowledge their anxiety or their emotions or who they are, because they're real. For them, they're actually real. So you just need to listen to those people and acknowledge, I can really see why you're feeling anxious. And that really helps as well. So there's a great question there about humility.
Where does humility sit within the dynamic of trust? From Nick. Hi, Nick.
And I'm just loving this because I already pulled out some books. so thank you, Nick. But that one I would recommend you read, Humilitas by John Dixon. John Dixon's a theologian, and he describes what humility actually is and what it's not from a theological point of view, and what its benefits are. And there's a great quote in there that says you can be steel-willed as well as humble. So you can be a very stern, tough leader, but still incredibly humble. So a lot of people get mixed up with what the definition of humility is. Margaret, would you agree? Or?
Yes, and actually, I'm having met Nick, having had the pleasure of meeting Nick in Sydney a couple of years ago. I would reckon he may well have that book.
Well, John's based in Sydney. He's at Macquarie University. I suppose one of his jobs. So yeah.
Yeah. And the, you know, I mentioned to you, I'm going to hold up a book now.
Oh, good. Excellent. It's a book off.
This one, which has a formula for measuring trust. T for trust equals C, credibility, plus R for reliability, plus I, intimacy, or like the relationship, over, so divided by self-orientation. And that is the sort of, the lower your self-orientation, the lower you think it's all about you, the higher the trust will be. And there's humility in there, that this is not about me. This is not about me as a person. This is about a much, much bigger thing. So
yeah, and you was describing that before we started the conversation. I actually, it really resonated with me. I'm really going to have to grab hold of that book, because real leadership is actually not about you. It's actually a job of service. You're serving a community. And I think a lot of leaders fall into a hole because they think as soon as you're appointed that position that you've got to be the font of all knowledge, you've got to be the decision maker, you're the one in control and all powerful. In actual fact, that's not what the job is at all. I don't know very much about curriculum. I'm actually not a very good teacher. So I'm pretty terrible, actually. I was trained as a primary teacher. But certainly there are people in the school who are brilliant at what they do. And my job is to empower them and enable them to do their jobs and do them incredibly well, to get rid of the stuff that's in their way so they can actually do it. And then use skills that you've got, like coaching and mentoring, because coaching, again, is not about having all the answers either. It's just about unlocking that inner power and ability for them to actually do the job themselves. So yeah, it's a job of service. It's not about you at all. So I really like that formula, Margaret.
Yeah, I can see parallels with that with coaching as well, because as a coach, it's entirely not about you, and it is about saying the least, you know, make a question in as succinct a way as possible, and then getting out of the way while the other person does the work, and they you know that you get you know, they develop and have their own ideas in the way that you've described with those wonderful teachers that you're talking about, because you're allowing them, you're empowering them to do that. You are a servant. And having said that, depending on how the contracting or the agreement has been, it may well be, you know, if it was a type of instructional coaching, there is an agreement that you would use your expertise. You know, Andy Hargreaves, for example, you know, collaborative professionalism says, why would you not share expertise if you had it? And my argument would be, as long as that's what you've agreed to do at the beginning, it's all about transparency at the beginning of the conversation, and knowing whether you're going to be sharing expertise or not. I can see you looking at other.
I'm looking at another question there.
So Chris Munro.
Yeah, that's
Chris
the one I was
has
looking
asked,
at. Yeah.
Given it takes time, what are the first small signs that we'd notice when levels of trust are growing across the school community? What would we be noticing more of?
And Chrissy, I was, Margaret, as you're talking, that was very rude of me. I was looking at that question thinking, that's a great question, because we're running out of time as well. So,
let's hear Chris,
your answer. One of the terrible things I had to do when I first arrived at St Paul's was, not only was there an absence of trust, but the school was also overstaffed. And I needed to actually make significant change. So I had to restructure the school to align it with what we wanted to achieve, what our vision would be, and to actually find some efficiencies there too, and then appoint people who were really, really good at the job. So that was a really hard thing to do while trying to build trust. And I gained a nickname that I wasn't told to my face, but I was called the Smiling Assassin, which is, you know, it wasn't very nice, but nonetheless, it was an indicator too of what trust was actually like. And as I said, when I arrived here, nobody was actually collaboratively planning. Nobody was going into people's classrooms to watch other people teach or giving feedback. At the end of a lesson, staff would scurry back to the staff workroom and shut the door. So there was no interaction between the kids and teachers outside of a lesson. So there was no, you know, that informality or those conversations that you would see in a school. So it was really, you really could see that was missing. And I would probably say some of the first signs that I started seeing as we built trust was staff starting to collaboratively plan. And they used to meet, but their meetings were all about transactional stuff, like boring things like, are we going to let kids to bring a drink bottle into their classroom? Yes, no. What about mobile phones? We shouldn't be allowing them to do that. You know, all that sort of negative sort of connotation and talk. And then one of the first signs was when people were willing to actually say, look, I'm planning to do this. What do you reckon? Can you give me some help with this? Or can you give me some feedback about this? And people actually starting to work together to plan learning for their students. And that was one of the first signs. Another sign that you can see is when people start to trust you, and Margaret, you would know this, they tell you things. They tell you things that perhaps you don't even want to hear, but they do. And the more trustworthy you are, the more they will tell you. And that's a real privilege when people actually do that, when you get invited into their world, into their lives, and hear their story and really begin to understand that. It's a real privilege, but also so encouraging to know that, gosh, this person trusts me enough to share this with me. After that, I started to see what I love the most, and that's creativity and innovation occur, where people were willing to take risks and try things. And that's really what I wanted this school to be like. I wanted people to have a go at stuff and take risks and try things, because that's when we see creativity and innovation flourish. And once we got it to that point and people were willing to have a go at things and take risks and make mistakes, then I really knew that we'd actually develop that trust.
Yeah, because the trust among themselves, collaborating, taking these risks or taking individual risks, and knowing that you are not, if it goes, you know, a bit wrong, you're not going to blame them personally. Then people need to know that. That it's otherwise they have a natural defense. I mean, if people have for years and years and years, the answer has always been no, or, you know, you did that wrong. People would protect ourselves. It's human nature. So it is. Yeah. It's a lovely thing when people feel free enough to be trusted to try things out and, you know, maybe get it a bit wrong. Okay.
And when you get to that point, gosh, it's rewarding. What happens in a school when people are actually taking risks and innovating, you can just sit back and watch what occurs, and it's just awe-inspiring. And I think the COVID-19 situation, one of the things I've loved the most is just sitting back and watching what teachers have actually done. In a tough situation, what they've done is just remarkable. And the way they've innovated and problem solved at such short notice and worked together, extraordinary. Just extraordinary.
Yeah, and that's global. I mean, that's everywhere. It's astonishing. It's really humbling, you know, because I'm not there anymore. I'm not in that space anymore, and I'm like you. I think it's just incredible what I'm seeing happening.
Yeah. I'm kind of a bit sad. Yeah, it is, but I'm kind of a bit sad the school's going to reopen because I'm loving what's happening behind the scenes now. But Margaret, I've really enjoyed the conversation tonight. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Very much. I was grateful again to Andrea for introducing us, and it's been really interesting to listen to you. I hope we'll stay in touch.
Yeah, well, I'm going to grab that book to start with, and we might continue a conversation online and just email each other. So, Margaret, thank you. And when the borders open up again, I'd love to come to the UK and perhaps an opportunity.
Yeah, it'd be lovely to welcome you.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank both of you for your generosity this evening, sharing, both of you being vulnerable and sharing your expertise with us on the importance of trust. And all the resources that you mentioned, we will collate them and share them with everyone through an email. So I hope you all can join us next week as we have Pazzi Selberg and Carol Campbell talking about empowering educators. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us this evening or morning in Scotland, and we'll see you next week.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.